Lesson 13, the respiratory system. This first diagram is just an overview of respiratory anatomy. We have some slides coming up in just a moment where we will look at each of these in more detail, beginning with the nasal cavity, and then coming down this diagram you see the pharynx, which we commonly call the throat, the larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea or windpipe, and then that splits and those passageways lead down into the lungs. So we'll look at more detail beginning with the nasal cavity. This is a mid-sagittal section through the human skull, and so if you see the nostril, the opening into the nasal cavity, then there are some ridges inside the nasal cavity. These are called the turbinate bones, and the function of these turbinate bones is they cause the air to swirl as it comes into the nasal cavity, and that makes the air pass over the mucous membranes lining the nasal cavity, and that warms and moistens that incoming air. It also gives an opportunity for any dust that is in that incoming air to stick to those mucous membranes. If we come back behind the nasal cavity, there is an area called the nasopharynx. This is the upper portion of the pharynx, and commonly we call that our throat. And so moving down the diagram from the nasopharynx into the pharynx, there's a little structure called the uvula. So on the right-hand side of the diagram, right in the middle, you see the word uvula, and that is pointing to the little soft tissue that hangs down in the back of your throat. Whenever you swallow, that uvula moves upward, and that blocks the nasopharynx, and that prevents food and drink from moving back into the nasal cavity when you swallow. If we continue coming down in the respiratory anatomy, when we get to the lower end of the pharynx, there is a fork in the road. Here we have the esophagus, which is the tube that leads to the stomach, and the other fork goes through an opening called the glottis, and the glottis is the opening into the trachea or windpipe. So air moves in and out through the glottis. There is a structure there called the epiglottis. Epi means over. The epiglottis directs traffic here at this fork in the road. Whenever we swallow food or drink, the epiglottis closes to cover the glottis, and that prevents food from going down the windpipe. The larynx is the voice box, and so here in this diagram you see the epiglottis that we were just discussing, the flap that covers the glottis. Part of this diagram on the left-hand side would be a frontal section where you can see the epiglottis. There are some folds of tissue which are the vocal cords. On the left-hand side of the diagram, this is looking down into the larynx from above, and so again the opening is called the glottis, and the vocal cords flank that, and so we can adjust the tension on the connective tissue by contracting or relaxing the muscles that control the vocal cords, and that changes the pitch of the sounds that we make. Extending down below the larynx is the trachea. The trachea consists of C-shaped cartilage rings. They're C-shaped rather than complete circular rings because on the back side of the trachea is where the esophagus lies, and we have to allow room for the esophagus to expand as we swallow food or drink. This is the inside of the trachea. Much of the upper respiratory system is lined by ciliated epithelial cells, and this is the surface of that as it appears through a scanning electron microscope. And so these little hairs that you see are the cilia. The goblet cells that are indicated here produce mucus, and then these cilia constantly move the mucus back up out of the respiratory tract. And so if there is dust or particle debris in the air that we inhale, hopefully it gets caught in this mucus, and then the cilia move that back up out of the respiratory tract. One of the problems that chronic smokers face is a chronic cough, and that is because long-term exposure to any pollutant, but certainly cigarette smoke, destroys those cilia. And so these individuals have the smoker's cough because they can't move that mucus back out of the respiratory tract, and it tends to settle down into the lower portions of the respiratory tract, makes them much more susceptible to other respiratory disorders. The trachea forms part of the bronchial tree. It's going to split into the left and right primary bronchi. These are going to go to the left and the right lung respectively. Then those primary bronchi are going to split into secondary bronchi, and then these just continue to split into smaller and smaller passageways. This is what will conduct the air into and out of the lungs. The lungs are a pair of cone-shaped organs. Of course, they are located in the thoracic cavity. The lungs are not identical. Actually, the right lung is a little bit larger. There are 3 lobes in the right lung, only 2 lobes in the left lung. We'll see a picture in just a moment. This shows us the lungs, and you see in the left lung an area called the cardiac notch, and this is where the heart sits. Recall, the top of the heart is just beneath the sternum, but the bottom of the heart is tilted to the left. So here again we can see the entire respiratory anatomy. At the ends of the bronchioles there are the alveoli. These are tiny little sacs that are at the terminal end of the bronchial tree. They are surrounded by a very dense network of blood capillaries. Remember how tiny and how thin capillaries are, little microscopic vessels. The wall is a single squamous epithelial cell thick. So what we see in this diagram is that terminal end of the bronchial tree, the tiny little bronchioles, these clusters of alveoli. The wall of the alveoli is a single squamous epithelial cell thick, as is the wall of the capillary, and so together this makes up the respiratory membrane. So we can efficiently get the diffusion of both oxygen and carbon dioxide down their individual concentration gradients because this respiratory membrane is so very thin. Inside there are another type of epithelial cell that produces a molecule called surfactant. And the purpose of surfactant is to reduce the surface tension of the water that's going to be inside this moist, or on the surface of this moist membrane. If we did not have surfactant, then the walls of these alveoli could collapse and the surface tension of that water would prevent us from being able to inflate the lungs. This is one of the problems that is faced by very premature babies. Of course, during gestation, the lungs aren't functional, and so this surfactant is not produced. Whenever infants are born very early, they're still not producing surfactant, and so many times their lungs can collapse. So they have to be treated with surfactant therapy in order to prevent their lungs from collapsing.